Okay, good day to you all, and welcome to another session of this high-level dialogue on the future of WTO reform. We have done quite a few with Pascal and some others. Today, I personally think that it is of a particular importance with, of course, Alec as our invited speaker and Trudi as our moderator. The reason for saying that is simply they are both from South Africa, and also to a certain extent they could share with you probably kind of African, not only South Africa, probably at large, the African perspective on the WTO reform. Because at least for my meetings with quite some ambassadors, those from Africa and other developed countries, I kept on hearing a strong voice saying that no, you cannot exclude the majority on the way ahead. And how do you tackle the developmental aspect, which is also always way heavy on the WTO and organization. So I think it's important that we hear from the Africa, and which of course is a critical part of this majority, which should never be excluded. And so with that, I appreciate very much, Alec, for accepting our invitation, and also for Trudi for helping to put us in connection. So with that, I would like to immediately give floor to Trudi and Alec, and please go ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lou, and good afternoon, everyone. It's indeed a great pleasure and a great honor for me to have introduced Alec and to be with you this afternoon. I think all of you would probably know Alec as a former Minister of Trade from South Africa during the period 1996 to 2004, particularly interesting years for the WTO. These were also the Mandela years, immediately post our democratic transition. So extremely important time for South Africa. But Alec has served in other capacities as well, of course, as a Deputy Minister of Finance, also as a Minister of Public Enterprises, and he has a distinguished career in academia, having worked with labor unions, but also played a crucial role in that democratic transition. Now he is the chairperson of UBU Investment Holdings and continues work on African trade, integration, industrialization. He's an advisor to several presidents on the continent and actively engaged in the African Continental Free Trade Area agenda, but also the industrialization agenda for Africa, working in sectors such as the automotive value chain. So it's a great pleasure, Alec, to have you here and to hear your perspective, not only from your time as a Minister of Trade and the reflections, of course, that you bring with that, but also from the private sector engagement where you are now on WTO reform, the future of multilateralism, and particularly keeping in mind these development imperatives which Lou referred to. We find ourselves on the continent with 32 least developed countries of the total 44. Indeed, there are more least developed countries now than there were in the late 60s and 70s, when the generalized system of preferences was developed specifically to assist LDCs to use trade as an engine for development and transformation. Most of the LDCs on the continent, unfortunately, have not been able to embark on this pathway. But, of course, since the beginning of the year, we've seen significant shocks to the global trading system, emanating from the America First trade policy. On the day of his inauguration, President Trump issued an executive order with a memorandum, the America First trade policy, and what we've witnessed since then has created notable uncertainty, particularly for small, vulnerable economies, and many African economies count amongst those. where we find ourselves now is thinking perhaps around new approaches, not only to mobilizing the WTO reform agenda, which we've been working on for some time, but perhaps a rethink about trade policy itself becomes particularly important. And I think from a development perspective, the important trade policy linkages which have started to surface in the conversations at the WTO, trade, industrialization, climate, and so many other issues that are so important if we're going to take a look at development from a comprehensive perspective. So on the African continent, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, so focus on regionalism. I think some discussions we've had in this series have pointed to looking outside Geneva, to moving a WTO reform repositioning, as DG Ngozi is calling it, agenda forward, may well be quite interesting. And Alec, perhaps you can share with us some of the developments on the continent and what these could mean and how they could inform the WTO reform, repositioning, reconfiguration agenda. So we look very much forward to hearing from you. And I'm sure there will be a lot of questions and contributions after that. So over to you. Thanks very much, Alex.
Well, thank you very much, Trudi, for that, and to Lou and others. Firstly, I think this is a very important initiative that you are getting underway, and bringing in people like Pascal and others to talk about things, because I want to stand back a little bit and give a context to my thoughts. It seems to me that if we look at the world trade system over the last 100 years, it's gone through one or two major structural challenges, and has actually, I think, when you look back on history, has done surprisingly well in addressing those. So the first one was, in fact, GATT itself, which took a crisis from the Great Depression to the Second World War. And from that experience of crisis, I think there was a sufficient consensus amongst the trading nations that a system of rules for the trade system was better for the majority. The notion that might is right, as opposed to collective well-being, was seen as problematic for the trade system. So GATT brings together, in a very comprehensive way, when you think about it and look back at those agreements. I've got the agreement in front of me that the Secretary General at the time, Ruggiero, gave me. I mean, this is a pretty complex set of rules. It's a lot of pages. So GATT, I think, stabilized the trade system after the Second World War. The next challenge, though, came in the late 80s, early 90s, and was really grappled with in the Uruguay round. And this was the changing structure of global economics and production, with the advanced industrial countries having achieved massive industrialization, and the whole concept of globalization becoming more and more important, realizing that the production system was no longer small economy by economy. It tended to be global, with global value chains forming. The balance of forces at that time, though, was interesting, because the advanced industrial countries, and the key players were the US, EU, Japan, and one or two others, were clearly pushing and very keen on free trade, because they were looking to open markets for their industrial products. But at that time, a number of the new industrial countries, and the key grouping that got together and started to work together was countries like Brazil, South Africa, India, China, and then later, of course, Russia joined, it was really in this trade arena that BRICS emerges. And our objective at that time was we wanted a global rules-based system for trade, but we also needed to ensure that policies that could facilitate development were protected and brought in. And I'm not going to go into the detail of it because I think at the final agreement, it was actually a very reasonable balance and compromise. I think all of us in those new industrial countries I've just mentioned, all of the trade negotiators, felt that we had come to a reasonable set of conclusions. And I would argue that that's actually been borne out by subsequent events. So the new industrial countries have industrialized. China has been the most remarkable success of the lot. So the WTO, as we walked the developmental path in the South, global South, we wanted to do it in a rules-based system, and we needed that rules-based system to allow for developmental processes. Hence, the special provisions for developing countries, least developed countries, GSP that Trudi's just mentioned. So it's a very, very complex agreement. But what I think it's emerged over the last 25 years or so is that there has been space for development. The WTO by itself and the trade agreements can't lead to development. I'm afraid development is something that's achieved by economies or by regional blocs. So we're now hitting a new challenge, really, where you've got a significant, a really major change in the balance of economic forces, with industrialization, manufacturing capacity in far more economies, China being outstanding. Various blocs like the United States have got differing problems. The United States, I think, correctly have perceived that they have been deindustrializing rather than industrializing. The European Union's got different problems. They've built their economies on a system whereby they imported raw materials and then manufactured those. They know that that can't be sustained. As the new developing world begins achieving development, it uses those resources and processes themselves. So it was inevitable that we needed to make adjustments to bring about that reality. Now, the important point in my view is that in the 90s, when we set up the WTO, I think the developing world made a fundamentally correct and important strategic choice. And that was that a rules-based system for trade, no matter how complex it was beneficial for development. We're now at a point where many of the former industrialized countries, as the United States is doing, are looking to retract from the trade system. At times they're completely just ignoring it. I would argue that we don't need some fundamental new reform. We need to thrash out how the WTO needs to work in detail in this new environment where the trade in manufacturing goods is not a one-way from the developed to the developing world anymore. It's from north to south, south to north. The agreement will need some tweaking here or there. The issue of investment has been one that's been around for a long time. And I think a very moderated, sensible approach has been taken in looking toward this idea of the international facilitation agreement for an investment. So it's a time not for some big structural change in the WTO, but I think a time for evaluating, reassessing how the system's working. Are there bottlenecks? Are there problems? And I'm afraid it's going to be a pretty big global political debate because the US has chosen a particular path, very different. Unlike what was done by the developing countries in the 1990s, it's trying to correct its industrialization problems through breaking with international rules rather than supporting them. And I think this is, we're going to have to deal with this serious problem. I would really urge that we stick with a rules-based system. For the developing world, it's clearly been successful for those countries that have succeeded. And as I indicated, it's not the WTO that can bring about development everywhere. So for Africa, the challenges we face as Africa is trying to address it is to build our own developmental path. And I think what's emerging in Africa, which would fit perfectly with the WTO system, is that we finally are addressing economic integration in a serious way. So the African Free Trade Agreement, Continental Free Trade Agreement, is forcing countries to seriously examine their economic integration, to take economic institutions seriously. I mean, one of the reasons why to actually use the WTO agreement, you need some pretty sophisticated, highly professional institutions to handle it. If you look at an anti-dumping action, it's not a simple issue at all. And it's deliberately designed to be fairly complex, so that it's evidence-based. It's not just might is right. So I think that for Africa, we're now heavily involved in looking at serious economic integration, how that can be done. We're negotiating complex industries like the automotive industry across a number of African countries. So, sorry, cutting a long story short, it seems to me that our target should be to keep this WTO intact, to make adjustments where we need to. I don't think myself that there's a need for some massive structural reform. I think it's more operational reform. And one of the big weaknesses is that in Africa, for example, the kind of institutions that would be necessary to implement the WTO agreements have not been sufficiently developed. So we need to put more effort into that. The experience I had on sitting on 2 disputes panels really convinced me that it was a very interesting and important mechanism for dealing with trade disputes. So when we have big powers like America pulling out of their appellate body and hamstringing a little bit the dispute settlement mechanism, they're doing a disservice to the system. Because there's no doubt in my mind that having sat on some of those panels, it's a far more efficient way of dealing with disputes than just battering at each other with retaliatory measures. So I think we're entering a period where the multilateral rules system has to deal with the new realities of the global economy. I think the structure is there, the balances are pretty good. There are clearly a number of areas where we could probably fine-tune and improve things. But if it were to break up, I think we would very rapidly run into an extremely serious situation of serious differences in how countries are able to respond, can respond. And in my view, it would be a very, very serious setback for the process of development and for continents like Africa that need a rules-based system to allow for their collective well-being. Let me end there. I won't get into more detail, I guess, but I hope I've sort of set a context.
Alec, thanks so much for that. I think you are perhaps within this group talking to those of us committed to supporting multilateral rules-based trade governance. But you have raised a number of issues around operational and other issues that have to be addressed. I think without summarizing, it's probably a good opportunity to open up and to hear from our participants, questions, contributions. So the floor is open. I see Jonathan already. Jonathan, please go ahead.
Alec, thank you so much for drawing on your vast and accumulated insights and experience. Let me just pose a question, almost as we say in baseball terms, a softball for you to elaborate. Facing today's and tomorrow's challenges and the agenda crying out for building consensus, industrial subsidies, the leftover agriculture universe, state-owned enterprises, and so on. We in this forum have discussed from time to time that these issues engage pretty sovereign matters of domestic policy, and thus it may be an agenda that requires not just attention from the experts and technocrats in Geneva, but engagement from capitals, because there are political and fundamental public policy issues among the member countries of the WTO. How do you think, in today's fractured chemistry between the US administration and China, between North and South, and so on, how would you see building out a capital-based consensus, even if the ambassadors all share a common cause?
Yeah, a very tough question. But this very exercise of probing the experience of the WTO's formation and people that investigate is quite important, because I think that I'll talk from South Africa's perspective. As we were looking towards a transition towards democracy, we set up research groups benefiting very greatly from advice from all over the world. And we came to the conclusion that industrial policy, which we needed to industrialize in South Africa for our own development, and is still a challenge, is complex and difficult stuff. Could it be regulated properly? And we came to the conclusion that it could. And in reading again the agreements on subsidies, the agreements on anti-dumping, looking at a specific little used and little known part of the WTO, section 1, a very short agreement called trade-related investment measures, which was something that South Africa, Brazil, and Australia pushed very hard for, because it fitted with the automotive policies that we were introducing at that time. We came to the conclusion that it was better to have rules, but rules that gave you space to use support instruments for development, than not to have rules. The one that we were fairly cautious about for many, many years, even now some countries are still very cautious about it, was the question of investment. Yeah, because the sort of sovereign power over your investment was important. But we have got, if you think about it, agriculture is a bit of an outlier, but if you look at minerals and ores and mining, there's greater degree of sovereign power over those strategic products. So I'm trying to say that you can, in the detail of negotiation, do this. Now, how would you bring the capitals together to do it is interesting. Quite a lot is actually happening in BRICS. So the early discussions and formations with BRICS and the formation of a development bank, and these are countries that have had a lot of recent experience in industrial policy, and where they pretty much these days, I would say, share a very common view of how you can implement industrial policy without breaking up the WTO. So there's going to be some discussion about this in the G20 here in South Africa. The short answer after that long spiel, Jonathan, would be, I think you need a few key countries to start talking to each other. and putting forward agreements, proposals. There's nothing very, very new we have to put together. It's really just to get the capitals to commit. And one can understand, if you stand far back, you can understand what the US, this current administration wants to achieve. Whether they're going about it with mechanisms that will work or not, experience will tell. But I would say facilitating a core group of countries to look at the current conjuncture and see what should be done is possible. And within the BRICS platform, there's quite a lot of discussion around that. The G20, hopefully they'll get a serious discussion going on this. We've been part of a process over the last 5-10 years of a thing called the Global South Dialogue, where a lot of background research on industrial policy has been done between Brazil, South Africa, India, China. So there is a dialogue going there. It will take a bit of ingenuity and thinking how to crystallize that into what you very nicely called a capitals agreement. But I think an initiative has to be taken by one or other of the far-sighted groups. And I think you're perfectly correct. This is not a sort of change in perspective that can be achieved by ambassadors only in Geneva. I fully agree with you. We need an initiative that comes out of the capitals.
Alec, thanks very much for that. Hector, you've put a comment in the chat room. Would you like to share that? Meanwhile, I'm coming back to Lou. Please go ahead. And I saw Ignacio next. So Lou and then Ignacio.
Yeah. Hector, if Hector wants to take the floor first, there's no problem. I also saw his comment. No, Alec, thanks a lot for this really insightful presentation. I just got one question about what you mentioned in your presentation as kind of new reality that WTO is facing to and how to adjust it or reform in a way. One thing probably particular for Africa, I mean, I don't recall exact figure, but my understanding is that the first thing is that among our experts, there's a common view that it's difficult to move ahead collectively among all 166 with different, how to say, perspectives, interests, and also the geopolitical tensions among the major players. So there's a strong appeal and a strong tendency of moving ahead in a flexible, plurilateral way. And there are already some there done, implemented, starting to be implemented, some done, but blocked. Some others are going in different pace. But my general sense is that African countries participating in these plurilateral initiatives are still, how to say, timid or limited, with the only exception of probably the investment facilitation for development, which you also mentioned in your intervention. So I just wonder how can we, I mean, when I say we, the WTO, other members, and also we experts can help putting something together to encourage more participation from African countries, particularly the least developed ones. Trudi, I'm not sure whether I'm seeing it wrong, but on my screen, it seems that Alec has checked out, or I don't see him on the screen anymore.
It also looks like that on my side. Let me just check the participants.
Okay. Stella, could you send a quick message with the link to Alec's email so that he could immediately find it and check in again? Stella, could you help do that? Okay, yeah, please go
What
ahead.
did you say, Lou? What did you say?
Sorry?
What did you say? To make Alec disappear? You must have said something.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, it is because of what I said. I admit that.
I think meanwhile, let's go to Ignacio.
Yeah, but I mean, I actually had a question for Alex, so maybe.
Okay, so let's park that then. Is there anyone who'd like to respond to Lou's comment and question?
My question is also to Alec, so I think it probably is.
Okay. So
Is-
shall we give it a minute?
Yeah. Let's wait for him to come back.
Yeah.
Of course, I mean, other friends of our group can always make further comments. I mean, it's not a question to Alec, but comments are welcome from anyone. Yeah.
Sure. Any other comments? I hope everyone has seen Hector's comment in the chat room now. See if anything else comes up.
Yeah, and also for Hector, what Alec said in his intervention about that we need a kind of dialogue on what is happening, what is not happening, what are the challenges. This resonates very much with your constantly promoted trade dialogue, right? Yeah.
Hector, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, of course, we need a dialogue. There's no question about that. But, you know, as much as we know that the US trade deficit, which concerns so much President Trump, cannot be solved by trade policies because it responds to other dynamics, fiscal, monetary, even social. The same could be said respect to development. I mean, it is just, to me, difficult to understand that we could expect from trade rules development. I mean, development is quite a complex thing. And if we want a dialogue, I think we have to go outreach beyond the WTO. For instance, I would very much favor consulting regional development banks about policies that are needed in our countries to develop and to develop competitive industries, which is a narrow task, if you want, because development is a concept that includes education, health, etc. But let's focus on competitive. How can we develop competitive industries? And it is not just about trade policies. There's no question about that. So we cannot fix it at the WTO. We have to outreach to other institutions, the World Bank, development banks, regional development banks, I refer. So yes, dialogue, of course, but who's sitting at the table? If it's just about Geneva ambassadors, this is a loss of time. I stop here.
Thanks very much, Hector. Anyone else contributing?
Yeah. Natalie just say that Alec is trying to join again. There's a computer problem on his side. So, yeah.
It's good news. Patrick, I see your hand up.
Yeah, everyone is being so quiet. I thought I might say something. The question that I've been thinking about quite a lot lately is, if we try to think, if we think of the way that the GATT WTO has developed over the years, since the late 1940s, it seems to me that it was essentially a hegemonic enterprise until around the 70s. And it seemed to work quite well fundamentally with a hegemon, which was the United States, with suitable support from other Western economies. In the 1970s, something quite important happened. There were the oil price crises, and you got the developing countries really coming into their own. The enabling clause, elaboration of special differential treatment and all that stuff. And I think quite a lot of the industrial countries were kind of unhappy with that. And I think it was also the beginning of the period when the United States started to question their participation. And I think it really was becoming an area, an enterprise that was no longer quite so hegemonic. So when I think of the Uruguay round and the establishment of the WTO, you can sort of like the empire struck back. And part of the reason for striking back the way they did was to make sure that India, Brazil in particular, stepped up to the plate. But the whole structure of the agreement changed, and a lot of developing countries felt that they lost things that they had won, that they had gained in the Tokyo round. And ever since then, with the introduction of services, growing complexity of international integration and so on, and the absence of a hegemon, has just made life a lot more difficult. One of the things that I think we could usefully think harder about is special and differential treatment. Because frankly, it seems to me that if you make a distinction between rules on the one hand, regulation, and market access on the other, the whole regulatory proposition is convergence. Over time, no country is supposed to have a significantly different regulatory set of obligations than any other. So when all this stuff goes on about special and differential treatment, it seems to me what's really being talked about is market access. And as far as market access is concerned, I think everyone has some special and differential treatment. You only have to look at different tariff structures and see, you know, who've got high tariffs where. And the industrial countries have very high tariffs, impenetrable, unless you get preferences, and that's another whole set of issues. Then their markets are impenetrable, and the way you get access is through some kind of favor. And at the same time, a lot of developing countries have had mixed success in trying to seriously diversify away from primary production. So it seems to me that maybe one of the things we could look at is the whole structure of special and differential treatment. You know, what is it? How does it work? But anyway, that's just something I've been thinking about. I'll go back in my shell now.
No, don't disappear. We haven't got Alec back yet. So, Patrick, give us some examples, some experiences that you could share with us.
Well, I mean, I did something a little while back for a publication that Bernard Hertman was doing, which spelled out some of the tariff structures that we were looking at and who had which tariffs. And it became pretty clear that there was a very obvious pattern. It was an unsurprising pattern where you had industrial countries with tariffs 10, 20, 30, 40% on agricultural products and labor-intensive manufacturers, and similar pattern for developing countries trying to develop industries which ended up only serving, in many cases, only serving domestic economies because they couldn't compete internationally. So, I mean, I think that's kind of at least a part of what's holding things up in the WTO. Now, what we actually do about it, I'm not sure. I mean, it seems to me that one of the interesting questions to take on board here is, where do we sit with the regionals? I remember in 2011 when we were doing these World Trade reports, we had a great idea in research. We were going to do one on trade and human capital, and we were all excited about it. And then Lamy said, you're going to do one on preferential trade. And I said, but we just did one on that 3 years ago. He said, you're going to do another one. You can do the human capital as well if you want, but this World Trade report is going to be on regionalism. And so then later talking to him about what he had in mind, he said, we have to reposition the WTO away from saying, as we have liked to say, we're better than you, you're a second best option, but whatever works, so to speak. That actually it's the regionals that have done far more by way of opening markets than the multilateral. And maybe we should think a bit harder about that relationship as well. I mean, if that in that report, by the way, if I remember the figure correctly, we came out with a number which said that on average, each member of the WTO belonged to 13 separate preferential agreements. Something incredible. So there has to be something we could do with about that as well. Okay, Alec is back, so I should shut up now. I'll go back into my...
Patrick, thanks very much for raising this extremely important. In some of the previous conversations, there was a suggestion to look at some of the more recently concluded RTAs like CPTPP and others and what we could learn from there. Alec, welcome back. Great to have you back with us.
I'm sorry about that. I don't know what's happened. Maybe someone didn't like what I was saying and crashed me. And it looks like my video has not come back on. Yeah, there seems to be a problem with Zoom.
But we can hear you loud and clear, and we've got a couple of questions waiting in the wings for you. So I'm going to go back to Ignacio, and Hector had a question as well. Ignacio, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. Actually, I found your presentation very interesting. Actually, the question which I wanted to raise is if one tries to understand what are the reasons behind the US having decided to move away from the system, one of them has to do with what Patrick Lowe also just mentioned, the balance of market access concession not corresponding to what they think is the current economic realities. A second one has to do with the issue of a special and differential treatment, self-designation. And the third one has to do with the view that non-market economy practices, meaning mostly subsidies, state-owned enterprises, are not effectively disciplined by the current framework of rules. My question goes really only to the third issue, because the problem seems to be that the United States is of the view that there is not a rule-based response to issues relating to subsidies, that because it's not possible to find an effective discipline, you just basically need to act unilaterally because nothing else is going to work. Now, my question is South Africa, would South Africa, in your view, be ready to work with other countries plurilaterally, because I don't think that multilateral is going to be possible at this point in time, to try to identify what could be a rule-based response to problems relating to industrial subsidies? I mean, of course, there's also agriculture, but for the time being, I would just like to work on the issue of industrial subsidies, because it seems to me it's going to be very, very difficult to get at least initially, the United States engaging in those issues, and you may need to identify a sufficiently broad group of countries, hopefully including countries like South Africa, Brazil, in an ideal world, although this will be very difficult, India, but also the European Union, Japan, and others, who begin to discuss how rules could more effectively deal with problems relating to subsidization, state-owned enterprises. Do you think that this is something that South Africa will be ready to do? And of course, moving in that direction would imply being ready to work plurilaterally, because you mentioned the investment facilitation for development agreement as being a good example, but for the time being, at least, South Africa is still of the view that this does not really belong to the WTO, and at least has not lifted its objection to its integration under the WTO structure.
Yeah, thank you very much, Victor. On that issue, for various reasons in South Africa, I've been looking again at the subsidies agreement and the conditions. My view, and I understand the issue you've raised, that the Americans were saying there's all these non-tariff measures that are restrictive of trade. But frankly, I think if you look closely at that, if they were serious about that, they should challenge some of those countries that they say are bringing about the subsidies. Because when you look closely at the agreement, what subsidy is allowable and what's not, is pretty detailed, set out there. It'll be quite an interesting challenge. It's the sort of thing that I was arguing earlier, that the dispute settlement mechanism is really, I think it was a really good introduction into the WTO, because it can then assess these sorts of issues in a lot of detail, look at the economics, look at the evidence. So I think if they had problems, as they say they have, they could have used the WTO to challenge it. That would have been a far more effective way of doing it. As in South Africa, this issue of the investment facilitation agreement is under discussion again. There have been some very interesting developments in government, and many of the older negotiators have argued that we should be part of that process. In looking at the agreement, my own view is that South Africa already does all that. It's got those things in place. So I think if you're pointing to the argument that if we could get a few countries together to work through some of these things, I would certainly support that. And I think you will find that South Africa would be open to being party to solving these problems through discussion. So in summary, I think the US didn't need to go into this sort of gigantic big bang approach on everything. If they had the problems they say they have, they could have challenged it in the WTO. They, of course, are vulnerable themselves, frankly, to challenges of subsidies too. And I think the whole environment of what used to be state-owned companies subsidizing heavily, these days, successful state companies, most of them governments just don't have the money to do that big kind of subsidy. There's been quite a significant change in structure in state companies. Certainly, a Chinese state company these days is pretty different to what it was 30 years ago. And the South African ones are actually going through a reform process as well, all of which would allow them to fit very comfortably into the WTO. The subsidy issue for economies like South Africa, China, Brazil is increasingly difficult from a fiscal point of view. It's long-term investment planning that becomes more important than a subsidy. But it's an issue that needs to be discussed, debated, thought through. I think any country that took the lead and said, look, let's put a group together and think about it, would be great. Maybe we should revive the old original grouping of Brazil, India, China, that used to debate these things endlessly. I hope that makes some sense in the answer.
Alec, and then Hector, would you like to make a comment? I know that you've posted some additional comments in the chat room.
Hector, you are muted. Hector.
I'm sorry. I thought, well, I don't have much more to say than what I posted. What I believe is that what we have in front of us is the need to reform the WTO. It's not a discussion about developments. But of course, many countries expect that the WTO would help them to develop, and that's a very fair expectation, a very legitimate expectation. Now, if we want to have that discussion and include that in any proposal to reform the WTO, what I would suggest is considering that, well, first of all, not asking the WTO to deliver on something they cannot deliver, which is development is not a matter that could be delivered from trade. Trade could help development. It could support development. It could not deliver development. And as I said in my first written remark, it is very clear that this set of rules that many criticize as having a lack of development, a deficit in development, I don't see it that way, because what I see is empirically the same set of rules allowed many countries to prosper and development, and others didn't. So to me, it's very clear that this is mostly about local policies, domestic policies and domestic circumstances, of course. So coming back, why are we meeting here? Because we need to reform the WTO, because either you reform it or it dies, it perishes. And do we want to load it with development objectives? Okay, fine. If we want to do that, then let's ask the experts to come and say, what could we expect from the WTO reasonably in a new WTO, to ask it. And do we need S&D? Okay, we need S&D. What kind of S&D we need? Because, first of all, I've said it many times, I really don't believe that many countries that are claiming the need for S&D actually need it. I gave the example that many of those countries, large emerging markets I'm speaking about, namely those sitting at the G20, in Washington, in the financial organizations, they argue exactly the opposite. In Geneva, they don't seem to be mature, ready to compete on an equal footing. So we cannot, the argument is we are not ready to take full trade responsibilities as rich countries can. But in the IFIs, in the international financial organizations, institutions, they argue the opposite. We are grown-ups. We're ready to take full financial responsibilities. Our weight in the world economy has outgrown our quotas, because in those organizations there is not one country, one vote. Votes are proportional to quotas, as you all know. Anyway, so the point is, we should not be beating around the bush. If we want to speak about development, let's invite the experts and let's see what we can expect from a new WTO, a reformed WTO that could be reasonable to include in a reform, and that would have strong arguments. So that's all I can add at this time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hector. I saw Patrick, your hand popping up.
Could I just make a comment, Trudi, if you don't mind?
Sure, Alec, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, Hector, I agree with you entirely. I don't think there's anything additional that needs to be done in the WTO to help with development. As I was saying in my introductory remarks, in fact, many countries, and you've confirmed that, many countries have developed in the WTO, particularly since the Uruguay round and since the WTO. So I think we would be chasing the wrong set of issues if we were to see that as the key problem of the WTO. I think the key problem of the WTO is that we need to make sure that members comply. And when we have a very big economy like the US who's just not complying, how do we deal with that? We need to deal with it through a negotiation, a discussion, so that we, at the capital level, as we discussed earlier, we have agreement that a multilateral rules system that gives space for development, which I think the WTO already does, is in the best interest of all economies.
Thanks very much, Alec. We've got Patrick and Lou, so I'm going to ask you to follow one another and we'll get a final response from Alec. Patrick, over to you.
No, I just wanted to reiterate what I was trying to, I don't think we're saying anything very different about development. All I'm saying is that if you actually take it apart and distinguish between regulatory disciplines and market access disciplines, you'll find that on the regulatory side, apart from the phase-in periods that you see after the rounds, you're essentially looking at the same set of rules for every country when it comes to the actual regulations, when it comes to how you value customs goods for customs duty purposes, how you use anti-dumping, etc. So by and large, these are uniform. They become uniform. So what's different? And where does all this? So that, for me, that means that the whole development debate, it blows up, and it's kind of it's a substitute for getting down to this more serious business of how you actually develop. But on the market access side, everyone's a sinner. Everyone's got their own thing. And are we going for free trade? Will we ever have free trade? How do we manage that in a sensible way? And just the one other thing that I didn't mention, but I do think is very important, has come up, is subsidies. Subsidies, you know, the United States can't preach to us about subsidies, not since the Biden administration. Really? I mean, so that's another challenge. I don't know, but that would be an interesting negotiation. What do we do about subsidies?
Thanks, Patrick. Lou?
No, thanks. Alec, sorry, your computer checked out when I was trying to pose a question, and then Patrick said the idea was because of what I was trying to say. Anyway, the thing is that in your intervention, you mentioned about this new reality and what WTO is facing to. And of course, here among our experts, there's a kind of quite shared view that with this reality among 166, it's difficult to move ahead in a unified manner. And so there's a strong tendency of moving ahead in a flexible way, a kind of a so-called open plurilaterals, different so-called GSIs, joint statement initiatives. And some are done, starting to be invented. Some are done, but not yet approved. Some others are still going on in different pace. But my general sense is that the African countries' participation in these plurilaterals are still limited, with the only exception probably the investment facilitation for development initiative, which you also mentioned in your intervention. So I was struggling. And I was asked by some initiators of GSIs on how to engage more developed countries, particularly those from Africa and the least developed ones, and how to help them be more open-minded toward this. So I would like to hear from you, maybe your view on this tendency, and also on how African countries could be more encouraged to join the process. Thank you.
Thank you. My own view, I think I'm agreeing with Hector and Patrick. The issues around development, I think, were very, very extensively canvassed in the Uruguay round and the WTO agreement itself. They were extensively canvassed in the Doha meetings. They were extensively canvassed in Cancun, where the final agreements were pulled together. So, to be very frank, my own view accords with, I think it was Patrick or Hector said it. I think that very often developing countries are using the WTO as an excuse for their own policy failures. Because the WTO by itself, as Hector said, and I agree absolutely, will not bring about development. Development has to be brought about by the country, adopting what are pretty complex policies, and being able to comply with the general rules of the WTO. So I think the area that the developing country should be focusing on, if you look at that trade, the investment facilitation agreement, if you look carefully, most of the proposals are about setting up proper institutions so that the investment process is pretty transparent. People know what they're dealing with, what the rules are. They know that the country is complying with the WTO. Now, that's the kind of work, in my experience in Africa, where there are only few countries in Africa, to be very frank with you, that have put enough effort into getting their institutions working. You won't find single points of contact either on investment or trade in many, many, many African economies. So what we need to put in place, and where Africa needs to come on board more, is to collaborate on setting up the proper trade institutions. And as we said earlier, and as Trudi outlined in her introduction, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a major step forward there. But it's going to go slowly precisely because most of the African countries don't have the institutions to implement or negotiate a full-fledged trade agreement. It's a very complex negotiating process. I would caution against too many plurilaterals, because then you're fragmenting a lot of the effort. And it's damn hard for a developing country, for many developed countries, to keep abreast of the WTO. It's a complex agreement. There's many hundreds of pages. So I think operationalizing the WTO agreement in each economy is the work we could be doing. I'm also saying if we spend too much time discussing what's needed for development, which we've been doing for a long time, we're chasing the wrong hare, I'm afraid. We need to be chasing the right one, and that is to make sure that countries can actually utilize the WTO agreement. Many of them are not. Those that have, I mean, China is, for me, a great success. South Africa, I'd say we've succeeded very, very well in utilizing the WTO agreement to our advantage. Market access and the complexities of market access that Patrick raised, I think, is an important and interesting one. I think it's fundamental that we keep the regional cooperation agreements within the framework that has been very carefully set up. If we start doing all sorts of weird and wonderful arrangements, we're going to cause confusion, and the kind of confusion you see in many areas at the moment. So operationalizing the WTO, I think, should be our real target. I don't think there's a great deal of big change that we need to make in the agreements themselves. I don't know, Lou, if that sort of answers your... And as I say, not too many. We take one or two issues as we've discussed. We may want to relook at the subsidy issue because the world has changed very significantly from the time that there was a worry about that. As Patrick said a moment ago, the US uses many subsidies as many other countries around the world. If we want to try and work out whether that's reasonable or not, well, okay, we could have a look at it. But a careful read of the subsidy agreement, if you implement that, or if someone were to challenge the US, if it was worrying them, I think they'd have a reasonable case.
Thank you very much, Alec, for that. Do we have any other contributions? Lou, I see we have gone a couple of minutes over time, but if there's any final contribution, don't see that. Alec, your final comments here, I think, were particularly important on a practical way forward, assisting the WTO reform approach. Subsidies, the kind of analysis, Patrick, you referred to on market access could be particularly important too, and operationalizing, making the WTO work for the developing countries. Taking a look at the regional trade agreements and plurilaterals, I think these are important avenues to focus on as well. So thank you so much for being with us this afternoon and sharing your perspectives on what is happening in the WTO, the reform process, but also some of the important developments on the African continent. The AFCFTA, as you've indicated, and I share that with you, is going to be extremely difficult to make this work unless we focus on the domestic building blocks, if you like. Trade and other related institutions remain particularly weak. And ultimately, the commitment to build those institutions through incremental governance improvements is still not that common across the continent. So there is quite a lot of work to be done on that. Lou, final word from you?
Thank you very much, Trudi, and also to Alec for this really great session. I mean, we'll continue to do this, but as you said, there are also many things happening or not happening in Africa, which definitely needs our attention, like FTA, and also probably next year, the MC14, which will take place in Africa. So I hope that in the future, we could have another chance to engage Alec and to learn from his insights again. And so with this, I thank you all for your attention, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.